Today we slid some CU-DIMMs to our 285K, just like I slid into this video. Ow.
Jawa is the #1 online gaming marketplace to buy and sell new and used gaming gear and get awesome custom PCs at amazing prices. Jawa's mission is to be the community where great gaming gear is sold at reasonable prices by putting the market in the hands of gamers by building the best place for you to discuss, buy, and sell your PC gear. Jawa is also proud of their GPU and CPU buying program, where Jawa will make you a direct offer on your used CPUs and GPUs to help immediately offset the cost of your new hardware. Simply click on the Get an Offer button and see an instant offer on your components. Jawa's buyer and seller protection policies ensure safe and reliable transactions, while verified sellers offer an increased buying experience through pre-vetted sellers so you can shop with peace of mind. To get started browsing amazing deals and to see all that Jawa has to offer from enthusiasts just like you, follow the sponsored link in the description below.
All right, so in today's edition of you don't care about, we're gonna talk about CU-DIMMs and the clock driver aspect of DDR5 and whether or not it actually helps on the 285K platform. So we kind of reran the test. Actually, you're gonna see 3 on our chart here. You're gonna see 3 entries for 285K. There's 285K stock out of the box performance profile for Intel, 285K with 8400 megatransfers CU-DIMM DDR5 from Kingston. This is the Kingston Fury. Not this set right here. This has RGB on it. This is standard UDIMM. The CU-DIMM stuff doesn't have RGB on it, at least as of right now. And then we have 285K plus CU-DIMM plus a 5.1 gigahertz E-core overclock and a 4.1 gigahertz cache overclock. So if you guys haven't watched the overclocking video, you probably should go and watch that, because the overclocking on 285K is completely backwards from what you would expect. Increasing the P-core actually hurts performance. Increasing the E-core helps performance, and that's because of the overheads and voltage limits that are put in place because of the DLVR and all the other aspects of trying to keep the CPUs from melting themselves down. Unfortunately, the headroom gets hit pretty hard, pretty fast if you try and push P-core, which then causes throttling because of power, which then causes a reduction in score. So it's backwards from what you would expect. That's why I pushed the E-clocks from 4.6 gigs up to 5.1 and saw a huge uplift, which begs the conversation that needs to take place in the future here regarding whether or not Arrow Lake is going to maybe benefit from a scheduler improvement on Microsoft's side, just like 7000 series, actually just like all Ryzen CPUs saw. Because what we're noticing here is if we're seeing a performance uplift with games, which you're going to see with the E-cores being pushed, that means the scheduler is not really prioritizing P-cores as it should, at least theoretically on the surface. So I have a feeling there's a lot of software that needs to kind of have some fixins, if you will, when it comes to Intel. So that would be a good thing if a simple Windows scheduler tweak could actually improve the performance of these CPUs, because that's free. That's free power right there, or performance. Okay, so let's talk about the CU-DIMMs real quick. The CU-DIMMs, or the clock drivers, are very, very, very fast. And the reason why they've added these clock drivers, it's like a signal booster on the RAM itself that basically acts as, it's communicating back to the CPU and vice versa, which is amplifying the frequency in the signals in a very layman's way of putting it, so that you're not relying only on the IMC, or the internal memory controller built into the CPU. Now, when it comes to gaming performance, we have seen faster RAM in a bottlenecked situation does lead to better performance for your gaming. So for instance, this test bench setup, it's the Falcon Northwest PC behind me. It's the same BIOS that we were running in our initial test. I want to point that out. There have been some BIOS updates since then. I did not update the BIOS because I have to narrow down any performance improvements to be hardware related only and not any sort of firmware update changes. Otherwise, that would just completely invalidate the test. So we are on the same BIOS for all of that. 285K with a 280 AIO. And the only changes we made was by taking out the 6400 megahertz UDIMM, which I was running at 6000, by the way, to be parity with our AMD 6000 megahertz RAM, putting in the CU-DIMM and running the test again at 8400 megatransfers. Now, regarding the RAM that's inside the 285K setup right now, it is Kingston Fury CU-DIMMs. It's got 3 XMP profiles, an 8133 megahertz, 8200 megahertz, and an 8400 megahertz. So we are running it at the 8400. Didn't have to do any sort of tweaking. I do have this G.Skill Trident Z5 CU-DIMMs as well. This goes up to 8600. I actually could not get this to post on the 285K at any speed other than like 70, 200 or whatever, very, very slow. CU-DIMM right now is not created equal. neither are the motherboard supports. So for instance, this system is running an Asus Maximus Extreme, the most expensive motherboard Asus makes for this platform, and it seems to have the least compatibility right now with various sets of RAM. Like I said, there is a BIOS update. They're continuously tweaking the BIOS right now to try and get better CU-DIMM support. So the Kingston Fury ran on it out of the box. The G-Skill does not. I also want to point out, when it comes to even standard UDIMMs, there is still no QVL right now. That's the thing about this bleeding edge technology stuff when it comes to RAM and all that. There is no QVL, including standard UDIMM that has been around for, what, 3-4 years now. So keep that in mind, that if you're buying a system right now, or building a system using this, and many of you are, because apparently they've like oversold, which is kind of crazy to think about, even though in terms of gaming performance, it's not great. Keep that in mind. Whatever RAM you buy, your mileage may vary, and you may or may not get the advertised speeds until later when BIOS improvements happen. All right, let's just get right into the chart, shall we? Let's start with Cinebench R24 single thread. As you can see, we did see an actual improvement from 145 to 150 by going with the CU-DIMM. And then the overclock gained us nothing in that particular test. Now, what I want to point out as we go on to multi-threading here, you're going to see a common thread that by just adding the CU-DIMM, even in CPU compute type of synthetic benchmarks, yes, there's a million different ways we can test CPUs. Right now it's synthetic. We're working on a different suite. It's going to take some time to get that going. Fun fact, I have Gamers Nexus helping me with that. So give me some time, okay? It's going to take a while to get this going. But this is the first and only time I have ever seen plopping in a different set of RAM, have it have any sort of uplift in our CPU synthetic benchmarks, especially in Cinebench, because Cinebench is 100% CPU. It doesn't give a shit about RAM. I have tested RAM at base clocks all the way up to like 6400 megahertz on standard UDIMMs and seen no improvement. So I cannot tell you if the improvement is coming from the fact that we now have an extra 2400 megahertz on top of that, well, 2000 megahertz on top of the 6400, or if it's something to do with the CKD that is inside of the DDR5 CU-DIMMs. So I don't know, but as you can see here, we saw a significant uplift of 2448 to 2518, and then another improvement that was actually greater by overclocking the CPU. Makes sense, the E-cores are doing a lot of work. Synthetic CPUs benchmarks definitely benefit from overclocking, especially E-cores. So if you look at the 285K in the single thread R23, you can see we get an uplift with the overclock and CU-DIMM, and then just the CU-DIMM by itself, it's within margin of error. That's why the CU-DIMM by itself is technically on top. Single thread doesn't benefit from the overclock a whole lot because I didn't push the P-cores. And a single thread is always going to be on a P-core. Now looking at R23 multi-core, again, an uplift from just 285K performance, about 300 points going to just putting in the CU-DIMM. Ran that test multiple times and that was a real 300 point improvement. 300 points in R23 multi-core can sometimes range 50 to 100, not 300. 300 actually means something different happened with the configuration. Then obviously adding the E-core and cache overclock gets us to a 44,656, exactly 2002 points above just the CU-DIMM. But that's showing obviously the E-core overclocking improvement. Okay, moving on into Blender. Again, same story, an uplift with the CU-DIMM, and then an uplift again with the overclock. But the fact that we're seeing an uplift in CPU synthetics with the CU-DIMM tells me that this platform really does need the CU-DIMM, which is kind of crazy here. If we take a look at Junk Shop, so each one of these Blender tests is a different type of scene that it's rendering. So it's not gonna always be consistently the same kind of hierarchy in terms of performance. So the top three were the 285K when it came to Blender Monster. But you look at Blender Junk Shop, the 285K was losing to the 7950X with a 173.44, but then just putting in the CU-DIMM jumps it up to 182.65, and then the overclock gets it to 188.02. Not enough to take out the 9950X as the king on that particular test, but the fact that we're seeing an improvement at all is kind of nice. Same thing here if you look at Classroom though. The overclock 285K with CU-DIMM obviously is king at 138. And then the 285K with and without CU-DIMM, margin of error, 131.68 versus 131.4. So the overclock really benefited that scene, not the RAM speed, which is why I like Blender, because it shows different types of scenes and how they can leverage the hardware available to it. Now in Handbrake transcoding, taking our 4K video and transcoding it, rescaling it down to 1080p, from 52 to 49 by just changing the DIMMs, and then from 49 to 48, that 1 second is margin of error by adding the overclock. Pretty solid result there. Now Geekbench one thread CPU test, as you can see here, from a 3297 to a 3408 with the overclock and CU-DIMM. And then just the CU-DIMM edged it out by about 24 points. Again, that could be within margin of error, but the fact that we are seeing the CPU move itself up the scale, not surprising. Now, when it comes to synthetics, multi-core, same thing, 24975 with overclock and CU-DIMM. But I saw a huge jump by just going CU-DIMM. That makes sense though, because Geekbench is a suite and it includes memory tests in there. So obviously from a 22,702 all the way up to a 24,639 by having the CU-DIMMs in there. So obviously the additional 2,400 megatransfers from our 6,000 megahertz test to our 8,400 megahertz CU-DIMM was definitely noticeable in that test. Time Spy Extreme, same thing, a 14,166 to a 14,405 up to a 14,699 with the overclock added. Okay, CPU synthetics aside, it did well in synthetics. It always did, and the initial test showed that. But what about games? If any previous testing has told me faster RAM will always benefit a CPU bottleneck. So our testing obviously is with a 285K, with fans at 100%, our 4090 with fans at 100%, 1080p medium settings were applicable, no ray tracing or any of that to keep the frames per second as high as possible. We want to be CPU bound. We're testing where that bound performance is between CPUs. That's the logic there. We'll start with Cyberpunk. 7800X3D is still king. However, we're 1 FPS behind it now with the 285K with the overclock and the CU-DIMMs. Ironically, the 285K with and without the CU-DIMMs are within margin of error of each other, 217 versus 216. So obviously the overclock in Cyberpunk is what gave us that jump from a 217 average to a 238. I mean, that's measurable. I mean, obviously it's right behind the 7800X3D, so that means something. And the minimums are still okay, but that's not 1% lows, by the way, that's minimum, so it's a little less meaningful than 1% low. If we move on now to Borderlands 3 though, 285K is actually on top with both the overclock and just the CU-DIMM. They're only 3 FPS apart, 369 versus 372, both of them actually beating the 7800X3D, which is kind of crazy. Because if you look prior to doing the CU-DIMM, it was second to last place at 315. So by just putting in the CU-DIMM, we went from a 315 to a 369 average FPS in Borderlands 3. That was the first test we actually ran to see if there was any sort of sanity check here to see if RAM was gonna matter. And when that happened, I ran it like 5 or 6 times to see whether or not that was some weird oddball run. The fact that it was getting consistent results of being 50 FPS faster nearly was like, that was when we went, okay, maybe there's something to the CU-DIMM stuff here. And then obviously with the overclock, we gained 3 FPS. That's like less than 1%. That's just run variance at that point. F1 2024, another high FPS title. 7800X3D still king, but by 2 FPS compared to the 285K with CU-DIMM and overclocked at 492 FPS versus 494 FPS. Now the minimums, 7800X3D at 404 versus 372. That's a pretty meaningful minimum. But again, not 1% lows, that's just minimum FPS. But you can see we went from, what, bottom half of the chart, 426 up to a 482 with just CU-DIMM. And then we gained 10 more average FPS by going with our overclock. So once again, showing the E-cores are doing some heavy lifting. Now, yes, the cache was also sped up, so the cache could be responsible for some of this uplift, but I did it as a whole because if we're seeing cache frequency being the deciding factor at where the bottleneck is with the way the fabric is designed and the topology of the CPU, just like we saw with Ryzen, we know faster fabric is important. That's why I decided to overclock the fabric cache interconnect on this from 3.8 to 4.1, which is obviously helping. And with faster RAM, the faster cache is gonna be important as well. And then if we take a look at Horizon Zero Dawn, it doesn't care about Intel. Intel's the bottom 3. The 285K at the bottom at 220, with the overclock and the CU-DIMMs at 231 and then 232 respectively. That architecture just does not leverage Intel in any way. It's the bottom 3. And then the 7800X3D is 52 FPS above it. All right, so Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we went from just a standard 285K in performance to 288 average FPS with just the CU-DIMMs up to 310. That's a well beyond variance type of run when it comes to improvement. And then by increasing the overclock of the E-cores, 323 FPS, so another 13 FPS. So from a 288 to a 323, we are talking nearly FPS, or 50 FPS again, just by the RAM and such. Now obviously the 7800X3D is like, hold my beer at 355 FPS, but that's a title that has definitely leveraged the X3D architecture. I can tell you this, we've been benchmarking recently a CPU that rhymes with Schmindy8, Schmundred, Schmeck, Schmedy, and I can tell you that all of these charts are about to look very small. So all of you should just wait. This all looks good for Intel in terms of being like, hey, if you're willing to drop extra money on a different type of RAM set, which by the way, I firmly believe if you are building a system from scratch, the Arrow Lake architecture kind of demands CU-DIMM, even though I'm waving U-DIMM in your face right now. It shouldn't be too much more expensive than standard U-DIMM. The whole design and idea of it is to not be that much more expensive, but if it's giving you this type of performance uplift and it's almost a necessity for the platform, that means the manufacturers can be like, hey, it can cost us 20 extra bucks a set to make it, we'll charge you an extra $100 just to buy it. That can happen, that's gonna be unfortunate. But I feel like 285X, 265X, and 245X definitely need CU-DIMM type of performance to make up for the latency and the speed of the topology of the tile design. I can tell you in about a week and a half, it ain't gonna matter. I can't give you any details, but I can tell you everything rhymes with shmazing, shmipiuj, jonching on Schmovember, schmik at 6 a.m.